Okay, son, what do we do after we go potty?
Should we wash our hands? We're number 2!
So, I just watched The Emoji Movie. That's a way to start off a video. You really just go around telling people that you've done something like that. Nonetheless, the point I want to get across is that The Emoji Movie has been criticized for being a ripoff of pretty much every animated film ever. However, no one could seem to pick exactly what it was ripping off. People have claimed that it was a rip-off of Wreck-It Ralph, the Lego Movie, Inside Out, or some combination of the three. However, if you've seen as many animated films as I have, mainstream animated films, you can realize that the rabbit hole goes a little bit deeper. There is not one thing that this movie does originally. There is not a single original story beat. I know that people say that there's nothing new under the sun, and no matter what you do, you can't get something 100% original, but The Emoji Movie is so unoriginal, it so didn't try anything new, that it has done something that no other movie has done before. This movie actually made me realize how formulaic animated movies have become in the past decade. Let me put it like this. The Emoji Movie isn't everything wrong with cinema, as many people claim, but pretty much everything wrong with cinema is in The Emoji Movie. And of course, it's definitely ripe for review. It's been something that I wanted to review since I originally heard about it. However, since most of his problems are cliches, it gives me a conundrum. I didn't want to constantly break the pace in an Emoji Movie review to talk about why each cliche was bad, because it would break the flow massively. As spoilers, most things on this list are in The Emoji Movie. So I've decided to have a little bit of fun and sort of make this a pseudo two-parter. Today, we're doing a list of the top 11 worst animation cliches, because no one is immune to them. And in this list, I'm planning to go into detail on my problem with these select cliches, so I don't have to constantly pause my Emoji Movie review to talk about why this doesn't work in the grander scope of things. Let's establish a few ground rules first. While I am going to have a lot of focus on movies in general, I'm also going to be giving some focus to animated television, because that's also fallen into formula as of late, if my big mouth review didn't give that away a little bit. On top of that, I am only focusing on Western animation. I don't watch enough anime to really gauge cliches and overused tropes that anime suffers from. When you watch a lot of one type of thing, you tend to notice patterns and trends, and they've really been coming to a head in the past couple of reviews. I think that this list is kind of a necessary evil. I want to get this all out of my system so it doesn't continually bog down my reviews in the future. And you have to keep in mind that many of the things I'm going to talk about, they aren't exclusive to animation, but they're far more frequent in animated movies and television. And for a final rule, I'm going to ignore trends that have largely died, like animated movies obsessively trying to save the rainforest. With that being said, let's rip these cliches a new one and hope that they die for good. Disclaimer, not even good cartoons or movies are immune from cliches. In fact, some of my favorite movies of all time have these cliches. Sometimes these cliches come up because a movie that used this cliche was so good when it originally released. So please keep that in mind, as I am going to be talking about some movies that I really do like, specifically the parts about these movies that I don't like. You know, when you get down to it, the best place to start this video really is at the end. And nowadays, there's only one way that you're allowed to end an animated film, and that's a dance party ending. I'm sure that this one isn't annoying to only me, and many people might have expected it somewhere higher on the list. The thing about this trope is that it usually doesn't bother me in the moment, at least until recently with recent movies. The dance party ending, from what I can tell, started with Shrek, like many of the worst trends of the industry. And since then, every animated film ever feels like they need to end with all their characters dancing to one last song to pad out the soundtrack. There are two problems that I've noticed cropping up from this, besides the fact that this is in every movie ever. The biggest problem is when it really comes across like the writers don't actually know how to end their story and just go into random dancing, like it's a kid's sitcom from the 90s. The other problem is that everyone dancing has basically become shorthand for everyone is happy in this ending, until the sequel 4 years later. We don't need to go through the effort of actually showing these characters in the new lives they lead. They're so devoid of conflict that they could just drop everything they're doing and go dancing. I get that with DreamWorks it's tradition at this point, but it's just the legions of imitators that have sunk this below tolerability. And besides, it's usually just watching characters that are unskilled at dancing. That's not interesting. If you want to wow me with your unique ways your character moves, you should have gotten to that earlier in the movie. And it's always to some pop song that immediately dates the movie, which can be quite jarring if it's otherwise timeless, and has a message that's supposed to resonate throughout the ages. At this point, if you ask me, any movie that ends with their characters just dancing for no real reason can get Shrek'd. Yeah, that reference was painful. I know it was. Now hopefully, that's what you get to think about every single time that you see a dance party ending, because that's the pain that I feel every time I see a dance party ending. I can only justify this being at number 11 because it is at the end, and it usually doesn't affect my enjoyment of the overall product. Unlike...
Yo!
I've gone on and on about this one, especially in my top 20 worst opening themes list, so I'll try to keep it short. I've only seen a cartoon with a rap theme song work once. In history. The first Western television cartoon to air was Crusader Rabbit, back in 1949. It's now 2017. There have been literally thousands of cartoons to air in the meantime. And the only one of these that managed to pull off a rapping theme song is Danny Phantom. And it's kind of a scenario where the exception proves the rule about how hard it is. Simply put, you cannot make this work. It's always awkward, forced, and stupid. It always reeks of marketing hacks. And it is never made by someone who actually knows how to rap, or even has any decent flow. It's always an immediate attempt to cash in on pop culture trends, even if rap isn't relevant at the time. When Hammerman, someone who actually raps, couldn't get it down, what hope does some poor writer sitting in an office who doesn't know what an MP3 is have? Rap theme songs don't create the absolute worst theme song ever, except the Captain Planet Season 6 theme song, but they never create a good product, and they always create a consistently awful product. It's nothing inherently wrong with the genre. Theoretically, it's possible to make it work. Like, literally, we haven't fully determined if it's physically possible, but there are scientists and shit trying to get a definitive answer. The problem is that the genre seems to be attractive to the marketing hacks that want to be edgy, or grant their show or characters edginess. And it's pretty much a scientific fact that marketing hacks repel actual edginess and the ability to relate to the youths. The simplest way to put it, anyone who wants to make one of these rapping theme songs really needs to leave their bubble in order to write a good rap. But the second that they leave their bubble and actually do that, they'll realize that all but one rap theme song in history has been absolutely horrendous, and they won't want to write a rap theme song for their cartoon ever again. What puts this higher than the dance party ending is that even if it's for a good show, you've got to get through this stupid, awful theme song every time you want to watch a new episode. And it's just obnoxious. I went into this recently with my Big Mouth review, so I don't want to dwell here. When it comes to animation aimed at adults, I often get the impression that it doesn't want to be animation, because it seems like they never put any effort into the visuals. We have people made of very simple shapes with no dynamic posing, standing with half-elated expressions, just staring at each other, just talking about things that cartoons who actually wanted to be a cartoon would be animating. And that's even ignoring things like the dad noises jokes from Family Guy, or one of their cutaways, which was, no joke, about 30 seconds of a still frame while Peter waited for a song to start. When I originally brought this up, people had given me counterexamples, like The Boondocks and Black Dynamite. And yes, those shows are well animated. The problem is that one is 5 years old and the other one is 10 years old, and neither one of them are making new episodes. And even back then they were exceptions. Most adult cartoons look like absolute trash. The problem is that it's the standard, the default, and I don't really understand why. I gave theories that it could be because of how The Simpsons characters are designed, or that South Park is cutouts, but I don't know if that fully describes it. King Star King and Mr. Pickles went out of their way to be as ugly as possible, consistently, and not in an interesting way either. Alan Gregory almost didn't even try to be animated. And this problem gets even more crazy when you realize that it's in the good adult cartoons too. The animation is the worst part of BoJack Horseman, for instance, even back in season 1. I hear a lot of people bring up Archer as an exception. Archer is a little bit different, but that's because it has well-designed characters. The animation itself, the movements of those characters, is actually rather poor. It often looks like they're moving well-drawn cutouts in the earlier seasons, because the movements are stiff and the angles don't change. I don't remember the last adult cartoon I've seen that even attempted dynamic posing. The Samurai Jack cartoon is an exception. In every other adult cartoon, the arms are constantly at the sides of the characters, and no one has any body language, which is an incredibly important part of communication. And do I even need to bring up cartoons like 12-Ounce Mouse? Animation requires money. If you don't want to spend the money, don't make the animation. Not to mention that every episode of Family Guy costs $1 million. Makes those dad noises jokes just hurt a little bit more, don't they?
I fed up with this world.
Even with all that said, though, I still think that Big Mouth is the bottom of the barrel. There are no defending the choices made in the design of that show, especially when you can easily raise the appearance of the characters by doing something as simple as removing the character's lips. Here's a quick tip. In animation and in drawing, lips tend to look awful all the time. It's one of those details that's hard to get right and nearly impossible to stylize. Almost every character with lips that you draw will look better without lips. All of this gets even more painful when you learn that Big Mouth was animated by Titmouse. Even if you've never heard of them before, you've probably seen their work. They animated Black Dynamite, Class of 3000, and many intros, like the one for Avatar The Last Airbender, and the one for Megas XLR. Then again, recently they've also animated Breadwinners, King Star King, and, well, Big Mouth.
Get the hell out, Shannon! Get out!
What the fuck happened? I get that the impression of being an adult is that the world is all edgy and ugly, so there's a temptation to make the animation for adults as edgy and ugly as possible. But that impression is actually something you outgrow when you actually become an adult. And honestly, the shit animation in most adult cartoons does give me the impression that they're so painfully immature. And once again, not wanting to be a cartoon. Why is every single adult cartoon a comedy? Actually, no, comedies have variety. Adult comedy cartoons just don't. Animation aimed at kids has comedy, but it also has mysteries, superhero shows, action shows, fantasy shows, just a stunning variety. But animation aimed at adults that isn't anime or the Samurai Jack reboot, it's always a comedy. Just naming the most famous ones off the top of my head: South Park, Robot Chicken, The Simpsons, Family Guy, Archer, Bob's Burgers, Rick and Morty, Futurama. While some of them have subgenres, Rick and Morty and Futurama are also science fiction shows, they're all primarily a comedy. Even worse, they seem to follow one of two templates: the South Park template or the Family Guy / Simpsons template. Robot Chicken is an exception. I can boil down 95% of adult cartoons to trying to be like South Park or The Simpsons or Family Guy. Full English, Mr. Pickles, Committed, Alan Gregory, The Nut Shack, Adult Party Cartoon. This isn't building on trends or development. This is stagnation. This even seeps into shows that I absolutely love. BoJack Horseman felt the need to disguise itself as a Family Guy style show to get anyone invested. Rick and Morty feels the need to have Beth and Jerry, which are every form of awful. I don't care how realistic their portrayal of marriage is supposedly, they weigh down the show. Alone, together, they're miserable characters. When you come down to it, this is probably the most damaging thing to the reputation of television animation. It's common for adults to assume that animation is a genre like, say, westerns. It's not. Animation is a medium. But it's hard to blame the general public when every single fucking cartoon aimed at adults is interchangeable. You can either get South Park cash-in number 972 or Family Guy cash-in number 574. I get that when it comes to the latter, the same person is behind Family Guy, American Dad, The Cleveland Show, and was involved in the creation of Border Town. Some more pretty interchangeable shows, but that's not an excuse. Look at someone like Steven Spielberg. He directed Jaws, E.T., Raiders of the Lost Ark, Back to the Future. All movies that have wildly different genres and tones. Even one person can have a teensy bit of variety. Unless we're talking about adult animation, I guess. Then the entire industry doesn't. You know what would be really cool? Seeing a Western animated adult mystery series. You know, an adult version of Gravity Falls. Maybe a Western animated adult fantasy series. An adult Adventure Time. A Western animated horror series. An adult version of Courage the Cowardly Dog. I get that adult is the wrong word to use because These series are a million times more adult than Alan Gregory or whatever the hell Comedy Central has spit out, and that's sad. There is one exception to this, it seems, the Samurai Jack reboot, but I don't really count that in this trend because it's based on a pre-existing franchise, and it understands that its previous audience had grown up over the years. I'm guessing that the only thing that's stopping anyone from trying their own adult animated action series or film noir or fantasy is that Fox, Comedy Central, Adult Swim, they're scared. They don't want to take chances on this. I can tell that there's an audience for it nowadays. Adult animation in general is more accepted, even though it's all the fucking same, and it seems like people are craving something new. At least I am. BoJack Horseman did prove that people want something more insightful. People loved its deeper later seasons and absolutely hated the lowbrow first few episodes. And I'm absolutely fed up about sitcoms, about deformed fish people just talking about things that they should be fucking animating. If you want the mainstream to take animation seriously as a medium and not a genre, this is the place you have to start. This is what's going to change public perception. There are so many possibilities that adult animation is keeping itself restricted from, when the kid stuff seems to absolutely thrive on these possibilities. For years and years, we had to deal with a particular plague on the animation world. The live-action remakes of cartoons that would just animate the main character in shitty CGI, with kid-pandering comedy that didn't even entertain kids. And it would always be aimed directly at kids, even if the show was so old or unknown that kids probably wouldn't be in the primary audience. And in the entirety of the 2000s and much of the 2010s, it seemed like every year we got a new one. From Scooby-Doo to the Smurfs to the Chipmunks, all lowbrow awful. Not one of them seemed to crack the level of good or acceptable, and most people were constantly wondering why they made any money at all. Lately, though, the trend seems to have died. Maybe this is because of another obnoxious cliche that makes me wonder why on earth it's making any money. The Disney live-action remakes. I'm cheating a little bit, but at this point, it is a cliche, and it is one that I've grown significant problems with in recent years. It's no secret that Disney has gotten a love affair with remaking their animated films in live action, and quite frankly, it annoys me to no end. It annoys a lot of people to no end. Alice in Wonderland, The Jungle Book, Mulan, The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Peter Pan, and Beauty and the Beast. And this would go on forever if I just listed them all. Just assume that Disney is remaking every single movie that they've ever made as a mediocre live action whatever. You know, except for Black Cauldron or other movies that kind of deserve to be remade into something decent. I'm not going to try to complain about remakes in general, as that's a Hollywood problem that's been beaten to the ground, but I think that Disney remaking their old animation films into live action, even if there was no point to doing so, while shelving animated films like Gigantic, sends out a message rife with bad implications. How can we expect the general public to accept animation as an art form when it seems like the king of animation doesn't respect the medium? Because these are sellout moves. Think about this. Disney is making a live-action version of the Chernobog moment of Fantasia. Fantasia was a movie that was designed from the ground up specifically to set animation to classical music. That was the point of the film, to set animation to music. I don't care how cool you make Chernobog look in live action. If you're making Fantasia in live action, you're missing the point of Fantasia. And that's not even the remake that bothers me the most. On principle, at least. The Lion King remake is quite up there. Ignoring whatever quality that it ends up being, I'm kind of annoyed that they're calling it a live-action remake. By necessity, if you want the movie to be accurate, all of the characters need to be CGI, computer animated. Yeah, sure, they'll be on live-action backgrounds, but, Dinosaur is a film with CGI characters on live-action backgrounds, and Disney themselves considers it one of their animated canon. What's the difference here? You know, besides Disney now being too cool for animation. Many of the movies they're remaking are less than 25 years old, which is just absolutely absurd to me. I'm not adverse to remaking movies like Alice in Wonderland or Snow White, but Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, they're extremely recent. Much of the animation in these movies has aged absolutely flawlessly. You can watch these movies today and get the same experience you would back then. Especially because they're often shown in theaters. The Lion King was shown in theaters in 3D in 2010. Many of the times, Disney seems to have lost the plot on what made the movie so beloved in the first place. Mulan without musical numbers. Really. Not only one of people's favorite parts of the movie, but one of the best Disney soundtracks of all time. You're remaking Aladdin with no songs. Making Aladdin without Robin Williams as the genie. That's a battle that I don't even want to know if you want to fight. The most different version was Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, and it's gotten many detractors, and most people seem to prefer the original because the new one is too different. The most similar version was Beauty and the Beast, and people seem to prefer the original because they find the remake pointless, and it's not different enough. What's the point is actually a question I ask myself a lot when thinking about these remakes. Even some of the more off-the-wall choices like in The Jungle Book, or making Alice in Wonderland dark and gritty. We already have a dark and gritty Alice in Wonderland, American McGee's. Not saying another person can't try to make a dark and gritty Alice in Wonderland, but it's been done before. We've seen this. And we've already seen Disney try and tackle Alice in Wonderland. What's the point? What's new here? Making a remake and getting good critical consensus to match the original is a battle that you can't seem to win. If you go in the same direction, if you go in a different direction, it's a hard fight. But I think that they're doing this because I think that they have to. Disney is good at adapting things. That's what their bread and butter is. They've always gone back and made old stories new. It's something that they've been doing since the beginning. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was not originally Walt Disney's story. And at the same time, it's become harder and harder for them to access new stories. It's long been known that Disney has been fucking up the public domain for years. And I guess that they assumed that it would never catch up to them. These live-action remakes are what it looks like when this is finally catching up to them. Think about this. If the public domain laws were always the way that Disney had a large hand in fucking up, they would not be able to license Alice in Wonderland when they first made the Alice in Wonderland film. And there are several examples in the Disney animated canon. And now it seems like the public domain is so fucked up that they can't find any new material, since they've already done an adaptation of everything. So what choice do they have? You know, it's either buying everything from Maker Studios to Marvel to Star Wars, even if they have nothing to do with the image of Disney as a whole, or remake the stories that they've already remade, because Disney went out of its way to prove the usefulness of the public domain by killing the public domain. This is probably a topic for another day, but hopefully in 2019 we can actually stop this Mickey Mouse Protection Act shit. The Butt Monkey, the Megward the Wizard, the Jerry, the Oscar, whatever you want to call them. They're all the targets for abuse on this show. Entire episodes will be abusing them emotionally and physically, breaking into their homes, destroying their future, humiliating them, showcasing how pathetic they are in the grand scheme of things. And it's always, always painfully boring, especially when the episode wants to do nothing else. After you've seen the same exact thing happen to Squidward before in another episode, what reaction could you get this time, besides it being boring or cringeworthy? The worst Squidward torture episodes have a very claustrophobic feeling, as Squidward feels just trapped in a hellish scenario that he cannot escape from, no matter how hard he tries. And it's usually expected to be funny. All too often, it ends up feeling like an excuse for a joke, as it does with pretty much every Butt Monkey scenario. We wanted to put a joke here, but we couldn't think of one, so we're gonna abuse Squidward or whoever instead. Not helping is that when these characters do get abused, there is very little thought on the actual joke, when it comes to things like timing. As for butt monkeys like Meg, whenever she gets abused, it usually feels arbitrary. She'll be thrown randomly into an episode or scene just to get crapped on, even if she appears nowhere else in the episode. And it's not funny there either. It grinds the rest of the episode to a halt for no good reason. And honestly, it's quite sad. Here's a person who's just standing there, minding her own business, and getting crapped on. And while Meg does go insane in the later seasons, it isn't wacky and wild like it's portrayed. It ends up seeming like a logical progression of events. Because when Meg started getting abused in her show, she was just supposed to be an average teenage girl. Stressed Eric is one of my top 10 least favorite shows of all time because it's built on this principle, and it's a perfect showcase to exactly why this doesn't work. Something bad happens to Eric. That is the basis of every single joke in the show. It becomes predictable. And when comedy is predictable, it fails. You can easily figure out that the world is going to give Eric pain no matter what. And not only that, in the worst way possible. So it's easy to predict exactly what's going to happen. And before long, it gets tedious. And on a story level, when it becomes clear that it's absolutely impossible for a character to succeed, it's nigh impossible to have any investment in their attempts to succeed. Both comedy and drama do need investment. You occasionally need to mix it up, you know? And you only really do that by not having a butt monkey character. Butt monkey characters are intrinsically repelled from being explored in depth, given some established criteria to work with. Because the universe is just going to crap on them and destroy their dreams and make them realize that whatever they're doing is pointless. Jerry has some depth on Rick and Morty, but I know that the world is just going to crap on him in every opportunity. Every hobby he has in any random episode is just going to be used to showcase how pathetic he is. And thus, every time he's on the screen, all I'm thinking is, get off the screen so we can spend some time with the interesting people. I don't know what more I could say about this that I haven't already, besides the fact that this is another character type that you don't need to put in every single cartoon ever. Episodes trying to be funny that continually torment one character often end up more horrifying. You end up feeling sorry for these characters, and it can even end up tarnishing your view of the rest of the cast, as they callously go out of their way to beat up this poor innocent person. Not to mention that this trope found itself in many shows of the late 2000s and early 2010s that love to use the two douchebags annoy someone relentlessly formula, popularized by shows like Fanboy and Chum Chum. Animation parents. Just parents in animation in general. If I wanted to list each trope individually, it would take up half of this list. Actually, it would take up more spaces than exist. Fun story, I wanted to make a list of the top 10 parents in animation, but I couldn't, because enough good parents in animation didn't exist. I don't know what it is, but it seems like the medium is specifically drawn to making the worst excuses for human beings possible as parents. My hatred of Buck Cluck was pretty much the established tone of my Chicken Little review. I don't know what it is, but it seems like the movie tried to showcase his sadistic, neglectful treatment of his son as charming.
You gotta be ready to listen to your children, even if they have nothing to say.
Animation is a medium that lends itself to extremes, as making something extreme and over the top tends to make it easier to mock and make fun of. But when the comedy ends up failing miserably, you get characters like Mr. and Mrs. Turner in the later seasons, who gleefully throw their hatred of having a son in Timmy's face. You know, when they aren't neglectful and oblivious to his existence. They're almost constantly tormenting him. It happens a lot in shows that have gone on way too long. By the end of the Rugrats, you spend episodes wondering how the babies haven't ended up dead because of how oblivious to the world their parents are. Sometimes it's necessary for the plot, like in Dexter's lab. If the parents were competent, we wouldn't have Dexter being able to hide his secret lab. The problem is that, number one, it's way overdone, to the point where it's hard to find exceptions, and two, that many shows push it way too far. I talked a lot about the dumbass dad trope, and it's especially painful in animation, mainly because it's so ubiquitous. I swear, it's like a standard writing rule. You capitalize the first letter in every sentence, and you gotta make sure you make your fathers act like idiots. It's just how it's done. I get that the common response to this is that many of these shows are aimed at kids, and many of these shows want to make kids feel good, and they do that by portraying their parents as less competent than them. And that makes sense to an extent, but then you realize not only does the same problem exist in adult animation, but it's even worse in adult animation. Insofar as, I don't think I can name a single good parent in all of adult animation. The Simpsons, Marge is a nag and Homer is a dumbass. The couple from Committed, nag and dumbass. Glenn Martin, nag and dumbass. Family Guy, worse than a dumbass and worse than a nag. Beth and Jerry from Rick and Morty. Oh my god, if you hate each other that fucking much, why don't you just get a divorce?
Jerry's going to spend some time divorced.
Oh wait, they got a divorce, that's a relief. Oh my fucking god, how are you two even worse separate? Also, Brian Griffin is a parent in 3 episodes of Family Guy, and that makes me debate our validity as a species. Even if it's not particularly bad, this stock template is in pretty much any cartoon that I can think of. Danny Phantom, Jimmy Neutron, Rugrats, Fairly Odd Parents, The Replacements. And if it's not a parent, it's the prominent authority figure in the kid's life. I like many of these shows, but it's always something that I end up respecting a show less for. How can you be this creative if you end up using something so beaten into the dust? For movies, what do you get? Ignoring Buck Cluck, we've got Jasmine's father, who is a dumbass. We've got Judy Hopps' parents, who are closed-minded awful. Remy's father from Ratatouille, who is closed-minded. Jack Black's shark father, who is closed-minded. The Book of Life is a story about a father who is too close-minded to accept his son's lifestyle. How to Train Your Dragon is a story about a father who is too close-minded to accept his son's lifestyle. The Little Mermaid is a story about a father who is too close-minded to accept his daughter's lifestyle. Got a big twist on that one. Remember, the movie Ivan the Incredible is about a father who is too close-minded to accept his son's lifestyle, and you don't want to be anything like Ivan the Incredible. While many of the movies that I have mentioned are fantastic, like Ratatouille or How to Train Your Dragon, I'm not going to be kind to any movies using the same fucking template over and over again. It's done. Sure, let's pretend that all fathers everywhere are closed-minded to their kids' unusual choices. It's not interesting anymore. You can't interest me in a new story about this concept. This even annoys me in some of my favorite animated movies of all time. Inside Out, for example. The one joke in the movie that everyone hates boils down to the mother is a nag and the father's a sports-obsessed moron ignorant to his kids and his family. And this is ignoring the times that one or more of the parents is dead. Here's a trivia question. How many main series Disney films exist where both of the parents are alive until the end of the movie? Vote on your smartphones now! Out of the currently 56 animated canon films, less than a dozen of them have the parents living all the way through. Tangled was the first time that it happened since Hercules, which came out a decade prior. Before that it was Milan in 1998, and before that it was 101 Dalmatians. A span of more than 30 years. And the only times it really affected the plot was in The Lion King and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And that's what bugs me the most. When parents are dead in animated movies, it just always seems so arbitrary, like a random decision because the designers just didn't want to spend extra effort animating another parent. This death doesn't affect the main character at all. Maybe it'll come up about how the living parent isn't like the dead one at one tiny part, but that's about it. Sometimes you do get a story delving into the trauma and the emotions that this causes, like with Lilo and Stitch or Meet the Robinsons. But more often it's like in Aladdin. Jasmine's mother ends up dead, but it doesn't seem to affect anything about her in the entire movie. It took until Aladdin 3 before Aladdin decided to care at all about his parents. The death of a parent is something that always affects you, even if it happened when you were young. I don't know why animated films and even television shows keep doing this. You know, besides a cruel, sadistic tradition. Maybe they've gotten the perception that all animation parents are awful, and the only way to give the child character a remotely happy life is to kill them off. A lot of it is laziness. I get that a lot of it comes from the movie not strictly being about the loss of a parent, but it's not hard to add a bit of detail. A line here or there, something to suggest that this character knew that their parent existed at one point in time, or that their living parent actually, you know, cares about their kid. Once again, I've ranted on this in a recent review, so I don't want to go too far into it. But to give you an overview, I'm sick and tired of cartoons and animated movies breaking stereotypes in the laziest way possible, usually just for marketing or social brownie points. True to form, not only animation has been doing this as of late, but animation is specifically good at exaggerating, and when most try to tell morals using animation or one of these characters I'm going to mention, they tend to end up forgetting the nuance that's an absolute necessity if you want to tackle this kind of subject matter. You've probably heard of one of these characters before, I'm sure.
Can the young woman break the glass ceiling and prove once and for all that a female can be just as good an athlete as a male?
You know, Amy, anytime someone calls attention to the breaking of gender rules, it ultimately undermines the concept of gender equality by implying that this is an exception and not the status quo.
Fucking genius!
They added a female character because they didn't want to be accused of being sexist for not having a female character. And that's the only reason that they added this female character. But they don't know what to do with her, so they make her loud and obnoxious about being a girl. And she doesn't need no one, and how she could beat up all of the boys. She's not like those other girls. This girl is different than the other girls. She doesn't fall into stereotypes. She's a tomboy and she loves sports. You know, like every other fucking tomboy stereotype in media history. It's funny how only male characters are allowed to be masculine and actually hate sports. Apparently female characters can't do that. But I mean, if you only want to put in a token effort, you do you, I guess. These kind of characters are not breaking stereotypes, they're just trading old stereotypes for new ones. Then you have characters like the Powerpuff Girls in the reboot. Marketing tells us that they're an inspiration and what girls should aspire towards. It ends up getting kinda awkward when they repeatedly get captured and beaten and aren't allowed to fight like the boys and hold their own, because the show has some of the laziest social inspiration messages that I've ever come across. Do I really even need to talk about Miss Keena Miss Bellum again? Well, too bad, I'm gonna. Miss Bellum is a bad female stereotype, so we gotta get rid of her because she's a bad inspiration for girls. In the same episode, we're gonna introduce a couple more female stereotypes, the fashion villains, because apparently that's a good stereotype. And then, of course, there's moments like this.
I don't act like other dragons?
Oh, not even close.
But why would you want to, Spike?
Yeah, Spike, you're not like those other boys. I mean dragons. You're not a brutish, loud, bullying asshole. You should be more like the girls. I mean ponies. They're nice. You know, ignoring the bullying you for your feminine behavior. And they're even actually allowed to have varied personalities. Haven't you noticed? You could just take a bunch of female characters, make them males, and that will make them total jackasses. In Lisa the Simpson, the conflict is that Lisa might have a gene that makes her stupid as she grows up. But in the end of the episode, she learns that it only affects the males of her family, and thus the problem is solved. Even though it is showcased that Bart will be having to deal with this problem for his entire life. I did a whole review on Peter Asment that tried to break the stereotype of men can't be sexually harassed, but ended up saying that it was okay for a woman to rape a man if she was lonely. Like, it wasn't trying to be funny, it was a legitimate issue in the story. Once again, you're not breaking stereotypes, you're just trading old ones for new ones, and I absolutely hate this. What these shows think is progressive ends up basically walking us in an entire circle. This is so high on the list because it usually breaks the overall point of what you're trying to convey. This is what they're trying to accomplish, escaping stereotypes. And by running into any of these tropes, they fall right smack dab into them, right on their face. How good is representation of any minority if that person ends up being a stereotypical portrayal of that minority? That's the most common way for this thing to happen. It's why Brian's cousin Jasper was so viciously hated. And yes, I know that this is a problem that many media have, but like I said, animation is particularly good at exaggeration, so the problem is much worse here. On the other hand, you have the perfect minority representation, as showcased in episodes like Boys vs. Girls as Teen Titans Go, and Love Struck. While both of these are comedies, more dramatic stories tend to go on in a similar way. They end up creating an ideal that ends up being impossible for any reasonable human being to live up to, and once again, creates new stereotypes, new conflicts, and it doesn't end up helping the matters of representation in the slightest. Once again, because everything is far too one note. The girl is strong enough to beat up the boys, which she frequently does on screen. That's a perfect message that you want to teach anyone. You know, she's just a character. It's not like anyone's going to imitate her. Even though this character exists for the sole reason to be imitated. And this works out especially well because this is the most common type of female character to build, specifically to be a role model for girls. Oh yeah, Jailbreak, I'm coming for you. You're not gonna hack your way out of this. In 1992, the world was taken away with Robin Williams' portrayal of the genie in the movie Aladdin. He was a fast-talking, pop culture reference and delight. The performance was amazing, and it was funny. He was the true essence of comic relief, and he changed cinema forever. Now, every animated movie ever needs a comic relief character, even if it doesn't belong in the movie. It's strange because people go on and on about how much they hate stupid comic relief characters. And yet these stupid comic relief characters keep coming on in every single movie. Every time you ask, they end up being people's least favorite part of the movie. The chicken from Moana, the minions from Despicable Me, the gargoyles from Hunchback, High Five from the Emoji Movie, Mater from Cars. Each time that they've been the worst part of the movie, I have a feeling that they end up in the movie at all is because the producers thought that it's a kids animated film, and kids animated films need to have a stupid comic relief character. You know, except Coraline, or Zootopia, or Inside Out, or Wreck-It Ralph, or Ratatouille, or many other examples that have gotten to a level higher than the Minions could ever get. These movies work so well because they understood that you can't have all comedy in a movie coming from one place, or they will inevitably become annoying. And maybe, just maybe, if the characters are going so against the tone of a film like with, say, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, maybe it would be a bad idea to include these comic relief characters. I hate this cliche so much because of what it represents. The worst of this example comes from people who treat animation as a genre, not a medium. It's a kid's comedy, and so we need laughs within it. And we need to sand off our edge, because that's what you have to do with animated films. Or, of course, even worse, they're just throwing these characters in because they're mimetic and marketable. The forced comic relief is always the sidekick or best friend, and that's also becoming obnoxious. Hades was the best part of Hercules because he got to be both the comic relief and the villain, and he played both of them fantastic. The movie wouldn't have been as good if they were separate entities. And most of these movies that shoehorn in a comic relief, they don't seem to know how to write comedy well. Especially because, well, many of these movies shouldn't have even attempted comedy. Hunchback of Notre Dame is the clearest, most famous example. It's not a comedy. The gargoyles don't belong there. It frequently damages the tone. And keep in mind, The Hunchback of Notre Dame is my favorite Disney film of all time. In spite of the gargoyles, not because of them. Then you have the chicken from Moana, which was just pointless comic relief for having the sake of pointless comic relief. Because every movie needs to have a comic relief, except you're Disney and you're supposed to be better than this. This is why people were so apprehensive of Frozen when they unveiled Olaf before the movie even came out. Because even back in 2012, people knew the comic relief characters that didn't need to be in the goddamn movie were the worst. Luckily, Olaf managed to be one of the more tolerable examples, although he still has his moments. And of course, the poison of the trend makes me more apprehensive to any future attempts. Also, you can't mention forced comic relief characters without talking about the Minions. The Minions are proof that this trope is only going to get worse and more stale as time goes on. Other things get ripped off too, like South Park's shock humor or Ren and Stimpy's Gross Out, or Shrek. The difference is that the Minions not only have never had any good influence on animation, but I'm fairly sure that they will never have a good influence on animation. You can make shock humor work. You can't make Minions ripoffs work. It's always the same shtick. The only thing you can really say about them, the only positive benefit that they've had, is that they've kept Illumination pictures alive. With movies like Sing, The Lorax, and The Minions movie, that's debatable. Seriously, I watched the Minions movie recently and it is the most tedious fucking thing ever. But that's a story for another day. Animation villains are great, aren't they? Actually, I think that's a bit of a misstatement. Animation villains, especially Disney villains, have been great in the past. We've had characters like Frollo, Jafar, Ursula, Gaston, all memorable for all the right reasons.
Oh, Anna. If only there was someone out there who loved you.
In the modern era, we've got characters like Hans and Bellwether, both characters that are the worst parts of their respective movie. This is because Disney has become obsessed with the twist villain, and it seems like other studios are starting to pick it up. Hello, Smiler. And this bugs the hell out of me. Do you want to know why Disney villains of the past are so memorable and why the modern ones, well, aren't? It's because we have to spend the whole movie with them. We learn about them and their hopes and desires like we should for any character. It's not reserved for just the good guys, the heroes. Villains require depth too. They're not just forces of nature. This is why Hades is significantly more memorable than the Titans. Sure, the Titans are more destructive, but Hades is the one with the charisma and the personality. We know about him and what he wants and what he's willing to go through to get it. And we've known that from the beginning. On the other end of the spectrum, we get Assistant Mayor Bellwether, one of my least favorite Disney villains of all time, especially when you compare her to someone like Frollo, one of my favorite villains of all time. This is especially striking when you consider the similarities. Both of them want to oppress a specific class of people, both of them appear respectable to the public, both of them end up manipulating the hero of the movie instead of evil ends. However, even though Bellwether ends up more successful in her aims, she is a lot less memorable in the end. Why? Because we only got to know Bellwether the villain in the last 5 minutes of the movie. And anything else that we learned and knew about her, well, it was a lie. I think that the intent was to make her seem more cunning, but in the end it seems like lazy writing for the same reason that any bad twist feels like lazy writing. First of all, taking Zootopia aside, this is the 4th time that Disney had done this. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the 4th time that they had done it in a row. And that's if you discount the Pixar films, Toy Story 3, Up, and Cars 2. It wasn't a surprise, and I was fully expecting them to have a twist villain. The very second that Bellwether ended up on screen, I knew that she was the villain because she was the perfect candidate to be the twist villain. When the twist villain is done poorly, it's either absurdly obvious like in the Emoji Movie or in Cars 2, or it feels like something added in the last draft, like with Hands in Frozen. I keep saying this, but I feel it's important to note that I do like many of these movies. The Emoji Movie and Cars 2 are the only ones that I don't like, but sooner or later, a movie that uses these tropes will win my ire, even if the movie is otherwise technically fine. I had a hard time liking Moana because it did use a lot of tropes and cliches that I've gotten just absurdly tired with over the years. When it comes to twist villains, at its worst, like with so many Disney movies of the 2010s, it feels like the movie made their villain a twist villain so they could actually get out of spending time and effort, well, writing a villain. After all, if you couldn't pick up on the signs that weren't there, it just means that they were too clever for you, right? After all, Hans turning is supposed to be jarring. It's not a last-minute change to add some tension because the movie was running short. Bellwether turning was supposed to come out of nowhere. She was clever enough to hide the clues. Were you clever enough to find them? Honestly, Bellwether was just so predictable and so forced in, which you'd think were opposing concepts, but Bellwether taught me no, they're not. You could be absurdly predictable and absurdly forced at the same time. Think about this, Moana was the first Disney animated film in half a decade to not have a twist villain. That's a long time. It's not clever. It was clever in Wreck-It Ralph, the one that really kicked off this trend, but that's because we got to know King Candy as a villain halfway through, not at the very end of the film, and he was a consistent character all the way through. Hans at the beginning and the end of the movie are two separate characters. And honestly, Wreck-It Ralph and King Candy is getting to be kind of a South Park kind of deal, where I hate that it was done so well because now it seems like Disney won't stop fucking doing it. Then again, they've been doing this since Atlantis. No, I'm sorry, they've been doing this since Tarzan. Those villains are so practically identical that they run together in my head. The only reason Bellwether doesn't join them is because she's a sheep. That's not a joke. I'm being actually serious. I find that it's borderline impossible to have both a twist villain and an interesting villain. They seem antithetical to each other. I don't care if it was the innocent guy in the back, the hero's love interest, the best friend, or even the hero themselves. They've all been done, and especially recently. And I'm probably going to pick up on anything you throw me. The best example I can think of is Jack Silver from Treasure Planet. He's technically a twist villain, but only technically. It's pretty obvious to the audience that he's a bad guy. And so, it adds a very interesting character dynamic that makes him a stronger character. Dramatic irony is quite useful. We get to know Jack Silver's debate, wanting the treasure, but also wanting to take care of and not use this kid he's forced to watch. Compare him to Hans. Great, everything that I knew about him was a lie, and I need to start over where he's basically just a generic evil guy with a plan. That makes him so memorable. And now, because I only had 11 numbers, and there are literally thousands of potential candidates, here's some honorable mentions. All animated movies must be 3D, unless they're based on a TV show. I guess we all have our cliches. I didn't mention this one on the list because it rarely affects my overall enjoyment of the actual movies, but yeah, I do miss 2D animation not based on a television show, especially because the decision to make a movie 3D seems to be largely arbitrary. You can make a movie like Frozen or Tangled in 2D easily without changing anything. All stop-motion movies must be creepy or horror. I get that stop-motion can be uncanny and move in a creepy way, but that doesn't mean that every single stop-motion film ever should try to be the next Nightmare Before Christmas or Coraline. I'd also like to see that tackle more genres as well. Twins acting exactly the same, or cartoon episodes taking on the clones plot. It's amazing how often you get these tropes. You see, it allows them to save a lot of work because they can use the same character design once, twice, or even more, without any extra work. And it's even worse when the twins act exactly the same. Pretend you have integrity and write different characters once in a while. Songs interrupted by dialogue. You know what I love listening to when looking at my favorite animated movie songs on YouTube? That minute-long stretch of dialogue that breaks up the flow because no one bothered to cut it out. The Two Douchebags cartoon. Your fanboy and chum-chums, your Sanjays and Craigs, your breadwinners. I left this one off the list because it seems to be mostly dying, but it's still annoying going back to watch those late 2000s shows. Memes. Memes in animation are stupid. The time that it takes to animate something means that the meme is going to be irrelevant and out of date by the time the animation goes to air. It's always tacky. Gross out and shock humor. I've already talked about this one enough, so I thought that I'd keep it off the list. I still don't get it. The emotion of disgust isn't appealing in any way. It's literally programmed to do the opposite of being appealing. Movies about what your whatever does when you're not looking. Toys, cars, emotions, emojis, sausages, tampons, doesn't matter. If you're making an animated movie about this concept, you're fighting an uphill battle to make your movie interesting. Because it is so beaten into the ground. It wasn't even original when Toy Story did it. It's certainly not original and it's been done by every mainstream animated film since. Adding in useless characters. Dill from Rugrats, Sparky from Fairly OddParents, Bliss from Powerpuff 2016. This desperate attempt to save ratings largely seems like it's the death knell of any show. Refusing to age up your characters. This has been touted as one of the benefits of animation, but when you get down to it, it seems to be more of a hindrance at best and a crutch at worst, as shows become a zombie of themselves like with The Simpsons or with Fairly OddParents. I get the want to keep your kid characters at the same age for all time, but the way I see it is that most cartoons that get to the point where aging up their characters would be a problem have gotten stale, rote, and routine, and having their child characters actually grow up and go through new milestones in their life would actually do something to keep their shows special, refreshing, and interesting. DreamWorks face. Basically, because Shrek had this face in advertising, all animation films ever need to have this exact same expression. Also, we should probably throw in every single animated trailer being exactly the same. And I guess we should also throw in Shrek. Just everything about Shrek. Shrek had like a monstrous bad influence on animated movies, like just the worst. Many things on this list come specifically because of Shrek. And it seems like all of the horrible trends nowadays came because of that movie. And finally, keeping the same voice in a body swap episode. You're lazy and you have no faith in your audience's intelligence. And now, without further ado,
it's time for the moment you've been waiting for.
I'm not even gonna try to be hesitant or funny or whatever when I say that the worst trope in animation is the fake-out death. I don't think that I have to describe this one in any detail. It's that moment where whoever is not really dead because of fairy dust, a wish, tears, a literal reset button, or for no fucking reason at all. Silly heroes, death only exists for bad people. Any movie that tries to pull this stunt off should quite frankly be ashamed of itself. There is no reason to even try and attempt this anymore. Not even for comedy, because it's long past the point of being funny. Yeah, I get it, no one really dies in cinema. But when a character comes back to life a minute later, I think it's a bit of an extreme interpretation. What makes the concept of death so intimidating is that it's permanent. It only creates tension because it's something that you can't come back from. This is what makes it more devastating than, say, going to the bathroom, even though both can be insanely painful. If a character can just come back from being removed at the end of the movie, then they could have come back at any time if they were destroyed at any other point. This means that all of the stakes and all of the tension evaporate instantly. And it becomes insulting, like you took something that didn't belong to you. Let's talk about why movies do this. You know, beyond the animated movies have always done this, because yeah, this is probably the oldest trope on the list. After all, we've been seeing this since Snow White when it comes to animated films. The Disney death, as it's called, is used because producers of the film think so little of their target audience that they can't handle something that we will all have to deal with. And so they sugarcoat the idea so it becomes harder for the child to actually learn about the concept of death, and thus harder to deal with when it actually comes around in their everyday actual life. This is number one on the list, not because of how prevalent or how cheap or lazy it is. It is number one on the list because I think they're going to do actual harm. I don't mean that it's going to screw people up, but the constant messages that death is impermanent, it would make it a lot harder for a child to deal with the idea of death when they're eventually forced to deal with it. It would not make it easier. Talking about death, unfortunately, is something where you have to rip the bandage off. Not this middling nothing. I get it. Death is a difficult idea to deal with. Even as a grown adult, I have difficulty with all of its implications myself, but at no point would I ever want to be lied to about it in that it's a thing that doesn't exist. If a child had someone in their life that was dying, watching these movies back to back would confuse them at best, or give them a false hope at worst, that someone might finally cure that terminally ill family member at the last moment, or actually revive the dead. If they have had someone die, especially recently, this trope might piss them off, or give them complicated emotions that they do not need. And if they've never had someone die, this is a terrible introduction to the concept, and it's going to make it much harder to realistically explain death to them when the time comes. And as much as we hate to think about it, this is something that's going to come up one way or another. A character dying is a point of movies like Bambi and The Lion King. And anyone who would want to say that this kind of trash trope can make a film better, or easier to deal with, would you argue that either of those films would be better if Bambi's mom or Mufasa came back to life at some point? You're not sparing the emotions of a child by doing this. You're just holding off the inevitable, and making it a lot harsher when the inevitable comes crashing down. This is the most blatant and brazen form of talking down to a child that I can think of, and not taking them seriously. Yes, death could be a difficult topic to deal with, but it is one thing that is universal to the entire human experience, and it has to be done with due respect. And yeah, if a character that a kid really likes ends up dying in the film, a kid is probably going to cry. If you do the death right, and the character is moving, an adult is supposed to cry too. It's called drama. And if you're bringing death into the situation, getting your audience cry is usually what you're supposed to be doing. But no, back out with your fucking cowardice. This has been in so many movies that it has gotten to the point of mockery, where people are making parodies and jokes about it, even though it's still happening and taken seriously by movies. But even as a parody, you can't find it funny because it's been done so much. It's incredibly obvious and it's incredibly stupid. And half of the time, it feels arbitrary or forced. Speaking of arbitrary and forced, and join us next time when we review a movie that has many of the cliches on this list and many, many more.
Don't be scared, you got the mood prepared. Go on and kiss the girl. Sha-la-la-la-la-la, don't stop now. Don't try to hide it how you wanna kiss the girl.
There I was, came and I saying.